Hello and welcome everyone. We'll wait just a minute or two to allow people to join who might be coming a little bit late, and then we'll get started on the presentation. And feel free to put in the chat or mention if there's any issues with sharing or audio. You should be seeing my introduction slide for Microsoft Entra External ID. So yeah, we'll wait just 1 minute or so and then we'll get started. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'm excited to be here, and I hope you are too. Today, we're going to talk about Microsoft's latest offerings surrounding Entra External ID. My name is Paul Smith. I'm a principal security consultant here in the professional services team here at Atmosera. I have over 18 years of experience working in the IT security space, covering relevant items such as identity and access management, single sign-on, and federation. I'm joined here today with my peer Rachel, who will be assisting me on the webinar. Should there be any technical issues with audio or video, feel free to put that in the chat, and she'll raise it to myself, and we'll try and address if anything else comes up from a technical issue perspective. I do want to mention that there will be a Q&A towards the end of this presentation, so feel free to put your questions into the chat, and we can start going over them towards the end of this webinar. And at the very end, there'll be kind of a post-event survey that you can take or reach out to us regarding your Entra ID experience or any security solution offering that you might need assistance with. So with that being said, let's go into the agenda. So the agenda today, we'll cover the core components of Entra External ID, what it is, why does it exist, and how it could benefit developers and organizations that leverage it. Then we'll talk about the core benefits of using it as a CIAM solution. So CIAM is Customer Identity and Access Management. I'll actually be going over some of the common keywords to help level set those that may not be as familiar with some of the terminology that's covered in this product and throughout the webinar. We will then cover some of the deployment and configuration best practices for those who are getting their feet wet or maybe already using the solution in a production environment. I will then go into a technical demo where we can see the configuration of Entra External ID, and I'll demonstrate two integrated sample applications I've deployed, one that has been integrated with Azure AD B2C and another one with the Entra External ID. Then I'll show one that is actually hosted by Microsoft that you can even try yourself. After that, we'll talk about important considerations between Azure AD B2C and Entra External ID. And then I'll open the floor to any questions or comments that you may have. So, to help in understanding what Entra External ID is and does, it's beneficial to know some of the common acronyms and terminology that is used throughout this product. I do apologize if this is a wall of text. I've condensed this as much as possible to the most relevant foundational terms that I think you're going to need to know. For those of you that may be new to this solution, I hope you find this helpful, as I particularly use some of these terms throughout this webinar and talking about the product. So let's just talk about the very first foundational term, tenant. So when we mention tenant is really an organization boundary. It's a boundary layer. So within a tenant, you have users, groups, devices, your registered applications, policies, and services. A tenant you'll typically see if you use a Microsoft 365 service. So if you're using Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, that service itself has its own foundational tenant, which then has the users who have access to those services and groups and devices that are part of that organization. Second to that, we have the Entra ID, which was formerly known as Azure AD. So that is the Microsoft platform that supports the Microsoft 365 SaaS services. And I'll go over what a workforce tenant and external tenant is, but anyone who's using the Microsoft 365 services within their organization, they're gonna have an Entra ID workforce tenant as part of their internal workforce identity population with all those configurations of groups, users, devices, and applications. You'll then hear about business to consumer and business to business. Those are more marketing terms in my opinion, but they're really identity models that target consumers or customers. So I use consumers and customers interchangeably. They obviously mean different things, but in the ecosystem of Entra External ID and Azure AD B2C, you'll kind of see them conflated as one and the same for customer identity and access management, allowing consumers to log into the platform. So if you hear me say customer or consumer, they're really kind of one and the same type of identity reference for how I'm referencing it. Then there's also B2X, which isn't listed here, but that's kind of, you'll see that a little bit in some of the user flows and policies with Entra External ID, where you might be targeting both a business identity and a customer identity for your application. So that's B2X. The Entra External ID, I've abbreviated the EEID, which is the solution that supports B2C and B2B scenarios. And for external identities, these are identities that are sourced from an external tenant. So again, a tenant is a collection of users and groups and devices. So if I have a workforce tenant, I might have a reference to an identity in another workforce tenant. So in a workforce tenant, those external identities are considered B2B guests because they're sourced from that entity's source workforce tenant. But when I start talking about B2C and external tenants, they're actually considered B2C users because they're customers and consumers, external customers and consumers that are logging into the tenant. So again, these are kind of technical terms. Hopefully I'm not losing you on any of the terminology or jargon, but it's important to kind of understand how this solution plays for B2B and B2C scenarios. And then you might have heard identity and access management. A lot of organizations in their workforce tenants that support like their Microsoft 365 services will have automated provisioning and deprovisioning and lifecycle management of their corporate identities tied to their workforce tenant. A lot of times you don't commonly see customer identities being represented in there. Customers don't get onboarded to your employee HR system, right? Because they're logging into maybe a retail app or a loyalty program, or it's a supplier and the supplier might not be part of your ERP system or HCM system. So identity and access management is typically geared towards managing lifecycle and access for internal employees, maybe contractors as part of that CIAM integration. So there's another term, CIAM, which is the customer identity and access management. And that is tailored specifically for consumers, customers, and guests that need access to applications. It could even be business suppliers in a sense. So another term you'll hear is multi-tenant applications or multi-tenant organizations. Those are applications that are used in many tenants or tenants that access other services in a shared environment. And then lastly, a reference to IEF, which is the Identity Experience Framework. and that is just a XML-driven customization for Azure AD B2C. I'll mention that a little bit later on in what it does and the capabilities of that within Azure AD B2C versus Entra External ID. Then lastly, as I was mentioning, workforce tenant and external tenant. These are kind of two key pillars within the Entra External ID. You don't have to do anything necessarily to create a workforce tenant. You probably have one already. That's your employee corporate identities and maybe some of the guests that you invite as contractors or collaborators for Microsoft 365 services. That external tenant is what's geared towards, again, the customers. So it's a distinct tenant which contains all of the users as part of that identity specific to the tenant and the applications that integrate with it. So it's important. It may be confusing at first, but hopefully as we go through this webinar, it will clear up some of the reason behind why they're named specifically so, and how they're separate and how they're tied into the Entra External ID solution. So what is Entra External ID? It is Microsoft's next generation CIAM solution. It went GA spring of this year. If you're new to this space, you may be asking, well, what was Microsoft's previous generation? That was and still is Azure AD B2C. It's not a rename of the product like Azure AD to Entra ID. It's a new service with better integration with Microsoft Cloud Native security tooling and the investments that Microsoft has been doing with identity and cloud offerings. I'll talk about the key differences between Azure AD B2C and Entra External ID later in this webinar. But for now, the topic of focus will be around Entra External ID. So what does Entra External ID provide? It's a service that allows for organizations and applications to have a better B2B and B2C integration. With Entra External ID, you can quickly enable applications to support external identities without having to build it within the application stack itself. You can even design the solution where customers and business partners can bring their existing identity platform or social provider to your application without having to set up yet another local username and password specific to your app. You can also do that at scale so that as you register or build multiple applications, they can leverage the same type of external identities where they make sense across your solution stack. I personally view Entra External ID as kind of a two-pillar solution, one that focuses on B2B enablement and another on B2C. For B2C scenarios, as I mentioned, it's a cloud-native solution. Your application can easily integrate with it, whether it's one that you're building in-house. A lot of commercial off-the-shelf applications can also integrate with B2C as an identity provider for customers or consumers. And it provides that identity authentication and protection benefit to your customers globally and at scale. For B2B scenarios, it offers tools, policies, and security to aid in collaboration with business partners, guests, and within maybe your own business divisions if you're a conglomerate type of organization. And I'll kind of explain what those scenarios are in a minute. It can be leveraged to help secure user access, enable single sign-on capabilities, and accelerate your app deployment and development life cycles. And it helps remove that demand to house some of these elements, within your application. I'm sure if you go to a developer and say, hey, we need to have your application support multi-factor authentication natively within the app, it'll probably be much more of a challenge than integrating with a cloud-provided service. A technical detail I want to call out is really understanding the tenant types. I started talking about them earlier in the previous slide, but it is important to how Entra External ID fits into B2B and B2C scenarios. So if you look at the graphic on the right, a workforce tenant typically has identities from external organizations, such as suppliers, partners, vendors, as well as your internal employee base. But for Entra External ID, its use cases for those B2B collaborators. Those identities have access to or should have access to internal line of business apps. That's why they're being provisioned that type of access within your workforce tenant. You might be sharing or collaborating on a document, or they just need to access a line of business app that you've registered in your tenant for which you want to grant them access to. And they do that using the B2B collaboration tooling within Entra External ID, or maybe you set up cross-tenant sync or the self-service sign-up. I'll go into what those items are in a minute. For the external tenant type, those are, again, your consumers and business customers of your application who access the consumer-facing applications. So these are usually public-facing applications that they would need access to. And they would be using like B2C relevant user flows. And those user flows can tailor the sign up, sign in, and login experience and journey for your customers. So an example of this is an external tenant would be like a loyalty program or a shopping app or things that are tailored to your customers at mass. It could also be like your suppliers or some business collaborators that again are not technically part of your internal workforce but need access to that application or help support your business. One thing I do want to mention is a external tenant, unlike a workforce tenant, is linked to a subscription, an Azure subscription that would typically exist within your workforce tenant. So as your employees are building and deploying your cloud solutions at scale within the Azure cloud using the subscriptions that are defined there, they would provision those tenants within their workforce tenant and applications and link them back. So billing and subscriptions are linked in that manner. So external tenants, the call out here is that they are tied to a subscription, whereas workforce tenants, they're not tied to a subscription necessarily for billing purposes, right? You might have licenses and other type of things in a workforce tenant, but an external tenant doesn't normally have licenses or Microsoft 365 services. You're not going to have a SharePoint online or Exchange online service within an external tenant. And therefore, you're not going to have things like device registrations for customers, right? That's more devices that you'd manage for employees in a workforce tenant. So just a key call out there between these two tenant types. Before we dive into the workforce and external tenant specific capabilities, I want to cover what are the different user types an identity can have in any given tenant, regardless if it's a workforce or external tenant, because these are kind of the foundation, more of the technical details behind the scenes of Microsoft of how an identity is represented within any given tenant. So they really fall into 4 essential categories. Most of you are probably familiar with external guest. If you have a Word doc you want to share or a SharePoint site you're trying to give access to, you'll see the kind of invitation API driven through external guests. So you invite an external person to collaborate on a document. They'll then be invited to your tenant, and if they redeem that invitation, they'll have access as a external guest. And so most of the B2B external identities would fall under this type of user type that's defined when you look at your directory containing your external guests. They're going to be these B2B collaboration users, and they'll have guest level permissions. So there's different permission types because you can have an external guest or you can have an external member. And really the only difference between them is the default type of access policies they have. Because for example, maybe you don't want to give a invited user to collaborate on a document access to your tenant to see all the other users that exist in the tenant. So those are where you have different policy configurations between guest and member. So really the only difference between a guest and a member is slightly more API access to like the graph or to the directory or tenant if they're invited as a guest or member. And an external member is usually an external organization that you would invite that is maybe helping with kind of member level permissions within the directory. So think of like consultants, external consultants who are on an engagement might be invited as an external member because they're doing configurations to help you with your cloud enablement journey. Whereas an external guest is someone who, again, is just collaborating on a Word doc or Excel document or some Microsoft 365 provided service. There is a concept of an internal guest, and that's just a legacy configuration. It's really where there was credentials that are housed in a workforce tenant representing an external user that they would use to log in with. That's been pretty much superseded by external guest and part of the B2B collaboration of Entra External ID. And then lastly, there's the internal member, and that's, again, your general employee population that would exist probably from your IAM system that provisions your employee identities to your tenant, either as cloud users or hybrid synced identities. So those are considered internal members because the authentication happens internally to your tenant and not externally to another identity provider. The key difference, again, between external and internal before I move on is external is where your authentication and authorization can happen in an external tenant. So if you're inviting another external member who is part of an Entra ID tenant themselves, they would authenticate within their own tenant first. So if they're disabled as an employee, or let's say their organization enforces passwordless authentication, they would go through that authentication process first in their tenant before they get access and the defined authorizations and the resource tenant for which they're invited as an external member. Whereas the internal member is just specifically authentication controls local to that tenant. So that's really the key difference. External member, I have to do almost external authentication to prove myself before I get access to what I was invited to. Internal member, I'm doing the authentication locally in that tenant. So let's move on from that and dive into workforce tenant capabilities within Entra External ID. So again, some of these you might already be familiar with. The B2B collaboration is probably the most common today with Microsoft 365 services. It's kind of what I would call ad hoc driven. So you have maybe someone in the legal department that needs a contractor or external resource to review a document. You may invite them to collaborate on that document. And when you invite them, it'll go through the Microsoft's B2B collaboration invitation services. So they'll get a notification if they've not already been invited to the tenant to access services, saying, hey, you're invited to access this document or the My Apps portal for this tenant. Click here to redeem your email or redeem your invite. And then once they redeem it, they're represented as a external guest within the tenant and then get access to those services. So it's probably the most common that you may have bumped into today. But there's also other feature sets of workforce tenant capability within Entra External ID. And one of them is the B2B Direct Connect. So with B2B Direct Connect, it's relatively new, but it allows you, I think of it more like an Active Directory Forest Trust, if you're familiar with that, where you can establish the inbound and outbound trust boundaries between two tenants. So instead of having to manually invite, a set of users, especially if it's like a subsidiary organization that you're working with and you don't want to invite every single member, but you have your own tenant for which you want to share that kind of access between. That's where B2B Direct Connect can help, especially in the use case of a Microsoft Teams share channel. The big call out here with B2B Direct Connect is that unlike the B2B collaboration where you're invited as a guest, you typically log into their tenant after you authenticate in your own as an external guest. With B2B Direct Connect, you just stay in your tenant and you access those services like the Microsoft Teams share channel on the other side. So you actually see that while still being part of your home tenant. So this is probably only ever seen if you've been invited to other tenants where you can switch between, especially in Teams, the new version of Teams, between what tenant you're logged into and what you can see within that tenant as a guest or a member. With B2B Direct Connect, you don't have to do that. It's just part of that trust settings that you define for inbound and outbound. Next, we have the self-service sign-up. That's part of a feature of Entra External ID, and really this allows external guests to invite themselves. Instead of waiting for someone to invite them or setting up this kind of two-way trust, they can go to the application in question, and this is specifically designed for application flows. And that application can be designed to allow them to self-service sign up and create their own identity and accounts. And I do have a screenshot of that here in the slide. You can permit, only their email, but it also gives them the ability to use like a social identity or third-party identity provider like Google. With the self-service sign-up, I would think, an example of that would be maybe a supplier trying to register or become part of an organization as a supplier. So maybe it's a public-facing internet site that is more for B2B collaboration, where you don't want to have to always invite them. They can invite themselves and kind of start that type of process with the business-to-business partnership. So that's kind of one example of how I can see this self-service sign-up plugging into that. Next, we have the external collaboration settings. So these are really policy-driven settings within a workforce tenant. So for example, guest user access restrictions. What type of access do they have, by default? Are they, again, member level, guest level? What type of permission sets that you allow for those personas? You can apply guest invite restrictions, which is basically saying who is allowed to invite others. Is it only administrators of the workforce tenant that can invite guests, or maybe it's certain departments, or is it everyone who is a member of the workforce tenant can invite others as guests within the tenant if they need to do any type of B2B collaboration? The collaboration restrictions can define who is allowed to be invited, which is useful if you're trying to say, hey, I don't want organizations that use Gmail as their main mail provider. They have to have a registered business or use some sort of more public registered entity or service, because I know that it can sometimes be a challenge determining whether or not a Gmail account is a business entity or just someone's personal account that they're using. So you can put those collaboration restrictions in place and determine the type of domains and users that are allowed to be invited. And then there's the self-service sign-up capabilities I mentioned. Can external users invite themselves? Another beneficial option is the external user leave settings. So are users who are invited to these tenants, are they allowed to leave the tenant after they've been invited? And you may wonder, well, why would I ever want to set this? And it's kind of beneficial because if that business entity no longer has any need to do business, or like it's been concluded, or they just not part of the agreement or partnership, they can leave the tenant or the organization so that they don't have access to it. Obviously, you'd want to employ a certification campaign to make sure that all your guests, are still authorized to have access. But this just gives that kind of extra ability as a invited person to have the option to leave themselves. And so that way, if they've been invited to multiple organizations and some of them they no longer need to collaborate with, they can leave on their own as part of that setting. And then there's the cross-tenant access. So this is where you can get really granular per tenant access controls, saying what users in your workforce tenant is allowed to access another workforce tenant if they're to be invited as a guest. So you can provide these kind of cross-tenant access restrictions and settings within your own workforce tenant for collaboration. Lastly, there's the cross-tenant synchronization. So as I mentioned with B2B collaboration, where you send an invite, it's almost ad hoc per person. The cross-tenant synchronization, it's really geared towards those conglomerate organizations. If you have a subsidiary in the US and one in Mexico, and they need to collaborate with the parent organization, this is where you can configure that cross-tenant settings that as those users get provisioned, they're automatically provisioned into the alternate tenant as well for visibility. So it's a way to do this in mass versus having to do it through an API script for the B2B collaboration invite or ad hoc one-off. So those are really the core components of workforce tenant capabilities within Entra External ID. Now I'm going to talk about external tenant capabilities, and this is again geared towards the CIAM solution, the Customer Identity and Access Management. So with the external tenant capabilities, you can quickly integrate into your applications. So as I said earlier, if you develop a new application and you want to allow customers or consumers to sign up and access your app, instead of building that in-house into the application stack or building a service to support that, you can leverage this already cloud native solution that's offered. And so it allows you to quickly accelerate and implement, the tooling within the application to quickly accelerate that deployment, design, configurations to support CIAM. And with that type of integration, you also have the ability for customers to bring their own identity. They don't have to necessarily create an account that is, again, specific to your organization. They could bring their own social identity as part of an option if you permit it. I mean, these are policies and settings that you can influence and control within an external tenant. So I think of it as a big benefit because I'm not sure how many of you have how many different accounts with how many different online services. It is beneficial at times when working as a consumer or customer to leverage your existing already secured identity provider, whether it's Google or Microsoft or any other third-party service that you might be using. You also have extensive branding and customization and the user experience flows. So there's a lot of capabilities using API calls as part of the login or sign up and sign in process that you can use within this external tenant for its configurations and capabilities. So Entra External ID and CIAM, they really go pretty well together. And they have a great integration path to support applications that need a cloud native solution. So let's talk about some of those benefits. As I mentioned, there's really many right off the bat. First and foremost, you get the expected UI customization and tailoring for your sign up and sign in experiences for your users. But you also get baseline security protections that Microsoft has, right, for all of their cloud-based services. Protection against bot attacks, protection against DDoS, protections against brute force attacks on that identity, the customer identity trying to log in, and then your foundation HTTP level protections, because this is a publicly faced consumed service for CIAM that your users would interface with and log in to. But when done right, they don't even know they're using Entra External ID. They may be redirected to the platform as part of their sign-in, but there's ways to embed that and bring that into the app so it almost looks like it's seamless and part of your application, but actually using a cloud globally scaled service. It's based off Microsoft's already globally scaled login service, so that it's being heavily used today. As I mentioned with workforce tenants, you probably sign into your tenant in some way, shape, or form using Microsoft's login service. It's the same thing with customers, right? Except now that it's branded and tailored to what the organization wants for that user experience. I personally think that's one of the biggest advantages with Entra External ID and external tenants is the fact that you're leveraging Microsoft's global login ecosystem that's been scaled out and built to support both their workforce and their customer identities. So again, it's a cloud native solution. It's 99.999% SLA. Another great benefit is you get 50,000 free monthly active users as part of the service. So there's no charge for the first 50,000 monthly active users. A monthly active user is a user who's signed in at least once. Pricing wise, it's a great way to start out or even kick the tires if you're trying to realize the integration benefit. And they've done a lot with integrations with popular frameworks. So if your application that you're developing is based off .NET, Node, Python, React, Go, Java, Angular, or even native iOS and Android, there's already a framework that you can use and import into your application to support it. So I always challenge people, think about if you had to host the customer identity login and creation process yourself within your application, it probably wouldn't be as easily scaled to what Microsoft already has with their login portals and product with CIAM. So definitely lots of great integration benefits. Now, quick time check, so 2:37 my time. Just want to make sure I give time for tech demo and questions. But I do want to talk real quick about best practice configurations. So if you're already using Azure AD B2C or Entra External ID, these are just some recommendations to keep in mind if you haven't already implemented them. For example, you want to make sure that you establish a separate tenant for environmental tiers. So if you have a production environment, you probably want a production tenant with your production apps and your production users, and then a dev tenant with your dev apps and dev users that you can test with. You probably don't want to give developers access to a production tenant where maybe they're only influencing the dev configurations and promoting it through a CI/CD pipeline. So definitely make sure you have that privilege access management separation between these environmental tiers to avoid a developer accidentally deleting some of your customers, right? You don't want that to happen. So having the right identity and access management for your CIAM platform is also important. Typically, we recommend creating like a break glass internal member for the external tenant or B2C tenant. So this is one that it's used as a break glass and is like a global admin. It follows the best practice with Microsoft security. Outside of the break glass account, you would have your developers access to the tenant via external members. So again, if your developer base is off this workforce tenant and they need to log in to the Entra External ID external tenant to do user flow updates or app registrations, instead of using a local account within that tenant that they can sign in with, they should be using their corporate identity to sign into that tenant. So that's the best practice recommendation here, is to use the external member accounts for developer access to the management plane within B2C. Also, don't create new tenants for each application, right? Think about how I can group my B2C and CIAM platform for all the applications that need to use it. Even if it's not the same customer base, there is definitely some opportunity where you might have a future integration with an app where you want to go seamlessly from one application to another using that same customer identity. And that's where some SSO benefits will come into play, having them within the same tenant. So definitely group them where they make sense and separate them where they make sense if there's different type of requirements for why they should be separated. And then there's some technical best practice and configuration. So make sure, the Entra External ID, it's not a web application firewall, it's a CIAM solution. So your application should, if it's a web application, should be protected against like the OWASP top 10 risks. Make sure it's not prone to SQL injection or any type of issue from the OWASP top 10 risk. And then also consider leveraging, your DevOps pipelines, right, to do promotion. Instead of having developers and administrators log into the production tenant, integrate that tenant with your DevOps pipeline and promote any of those configuration changes from dev to test to prod so that you reduce the security footprint of users getting unauthorized access to a production environment. And you can promote that through an approval process, pull request, or pipeline that you might integrate. Another big call out I always have is don't store PII or application sensitive data within these tenants. As you work with Entra External ID and create the users, they can actually have themselves attributes that you can define. So you don't want to put things like social security number in there. That's definitely a no-no. Only put identity relevant data that will support their authentication and authorization flow. Everything else you can use within your own application stack, backend database if necessary. And then there's just a few other points like leverage the MSAL library and test your APIs for resilience. If you're using Azure AD B2C specifically, and you're using the identity experience framework, consider whether or not you actually need it. So it's definitely a very configurable type of framework that you can operate that influences how your user journeys and sign up and sign in flows, and even your schema for your tenants, how it can be influenced and designed using the identity experience framework. But if you can get away with just using user flows and you don't have any requirements for custom scenarios that require a identity experience framework XML policy, then try and leverage that where as much as possible, because that will just better help you with the evolution of getting to Entra External ID or whatever migration scenario Microsoft would have to use the Microsoft Entra External ID as the next gen solution. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, if you're leveraging Azure AD B2C, there's definitely some linting and extensions you can use within VS Code to kind of help you with that journey, because those XML policies and definitions, they can get very technical and very cumbersome depending on how you're implementing them and what type of scenario you're trying to accommodate by using these customized policies. And then lastly, make sure that you don't store any secrets within the XML policies. Like if you're doing a REST API call, don't put in the REST API key as part of the XML code that you might check into source code or part of your CI/CD process. Use your DevOps tooling and the policy key sets within Azure AD B2C to help protect those secrets. All right, with all that being said, let's go into a quick demo. So I really have kind of 3 different things to show, and please give me a minute. I think I have this window logged in somewhere. And so what I'm going to do in this demo is I'm going to log in to the Azure portal using the webinar account that I provisioned a while back. To just show you some of these configuration items. And so as I log in, I'm logging into my workforce tenant with this account, which is requiring MFA. And then you'll notice I get prompted again. The reason why is because I'm also logging into an external tenant as a guest, which I have elevated permissions, so that requires MFA as well, so that's why I have it twice. So if I look at the Entra portal, in fact, what I'll also do is I'll go to the new Entra portal versus the Azure portal. And if I do this manage tenants, this user has access to these 3 different types of tenants. So I created this account as an internal member to my workforce tenant, which is really just my lab account, or sorry, lab tenant. And then from my lab environment where I have a subscription, I provisioned a Entra external tenant and a Azure AD B2C tenant. So again, they're not the same. They're tenants, but they're 2 different types of tenants. So in reality, there's 3 different types of tenants: a workforce, external, and a B2C driven one. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to log in to an application and show you this tenant. So we'll switch over to the Entra External ID. And again, I'm an administrator here, so I have to multi-factor authenticate because of the policy I've turned on by default. And within here, you have external identities. And we have the, what I did is I created a user flow. This user flow is webinar demo. And the identity provider, just to show you this real quick, by default, you choose between email with password or a one-time passcode. And there's different identity providers that are supported out of the box, right? Entra External ID, email, one-time passcode, Microsoft, and you can even import your own that support OpenID Connect, SAML, or WS Fed. For this, all I did is there's a website called jwt.ms, which all it does is show you the tokens that are passed to it after you authenticate to a service. So I created a user flow for this webinar demo. And you can, again, customize the user attributes for what's collected, the page layout, the language localization. The application I have integrated to it is both jwt.ms and this webinar demo, so I'll show you the two. We'll start with jwt.ms. And so, again, you wouldn't, the customer doesn't do this, but this is a way to kind of test like a identity provider initiated sign-in to the application. Normally I'd go to the application and click the sign-in. So I'll show you kind of the two different flows. So I'm running this endpoint and it's saying, hey, there's no branding or customization, it's just default out of the box. To sign into this application, go ahead and provide your email address. Well, I haven't registered yet, so I'm going to sign up. So I'm going to create one, and it's trying to remember if this is the account I used. Sorry, a different account. Paul Smith. I'm going to use my live account because I'm a customer. And then I will get a one-time password sent to my email. And I just received that. It's on a different screen, but it's just the code. Put in the code. Now, again, this is establishing a local account as a customer or consumer. So I'm going to just enter in a password. This is as if I'm signing up to the application. So I'll just say customer so you can see what this is doing on the back end or the management plane. And so I've created my account, and then the service has authenticated me and sent the ID token to the application. And again, all this is kind of handled by those library and frameworks within your application. It can say, hey, this is a valid ID token. It comes from that identity store and whatnot. So now if I go to a different endpoint real quick, and I have that bookmarked here, so let me just grab it. This is a different type of application. A single page React application. I'm just going to sign in, assuming this all works. And because it's already using this session, it just seamlessly signed me in. Yeah, with that customer account. So if I sign out, because I'm using the same private mode session, and sign back in, you can see it passed that ID token to this application, and that's just what's being presented here. So just a little demo application here. So this is the Entra External ID kind of sign up, sign in using those user flows that I was showing here. And again, the user flow just has the identity provider that's being used, the user attributes, the custom authentication extension was none. I mean, This can also be used to call like a REST API as part of the sign up process if you have needs to call a backend API from within the B2C service. And let me just see if I can show you one other one before I reserve time for questions towards the end. 1 second. I had this up. So this is the other Azure AD B2C tenant. I just showed you the Entra External ID tenant in app registrations. This one's different in which if you're actually using the Azure portal B2C tenant management plane here. Very similar app registrations, identity providers, API connections. There's more customizations you can do here because this is their first generation platform. So they've been building on this, and all the core feature sets that are here are available in Entra External ID. It's the advanced features like the identity experience framework and some of the conditional access policies that have changed and are being improved with the new Entra External ID. So within here, I have a user flow for this combined. And the one difference with this app registration is I configured a Microsoft account as part of a social IDP login. So here I can trigger one of the sign up, sign in, and because this is a different tenant, what I'm going to have to do is register my account within here. So here now, the UI is different, but again, can be fully customized if you're using Azure AD B2C. This is just the default. I have the social login availability configured for this user flow. So if I click Microsoft, I'm redirected to their live service because this is their customer or consumer facing service. So Paul Smith live. And I'm signing in with my live account, right? I'm not signing in with a local username and password within B2C. So the authenticator app that's registered with my live account triggered, I'm signing in, via my phone. And live redirects back to B2C, which then, because I'm signing up, it wants to validate one additional detail, which is my email. So I'm going to send that. Again, this can work with third-party identity providers, not just Microsoft, but Google or even any identity provider that supports SAML and OpenID Connect. So I got the verification code, put in my name, hit continue. And now that is registered as well. So you can see the identity provider is live.com and it has the claims that are part of that. So just to show you real quick how that user is represented in Azure AD B2C, you can see this is the customer that did the sign up flow, and this is the identity which is federated with live.com. And so again, you can do other identity federations if you're not trying to manage just local accounts as part of your sign up, sign in process. Okay, so let me go back to the content because I do want to save some time for Q&A. But another thing you can do is on your own, there's a Woodgrove demo. And this is Microsoft's public facing demo. So definitely recommend trying this out. You can sign up, sign in, and this is kind of the type of branding and customization that you could apply. This is part of the Entra External ID tenant configuration. So you can sign with Google or you can create an account. So definitely recommend trying out the Woodgrove demo. I'll put that in the chat for you guys to have if you want to test on your own or experience it without having to do any configurations within Entra External ID. Going back to the presentation, I just want to make some important call outs to Azure AD versus Entra External ID. As I mentioned, Microsoft's next generation CIAM solution is Entra External ID. The tenants created as an Azure B2C tenant are not the same as an Entra External ID tenant. The capabilities and features are different, especially when it comes to things like conditional access policies and identity protection. They're offered in both, but they're implemented differently through how the policies behave and interact. There is no announced migration or deprecation timeline for Azure AD B2C, so it is 2 supported solutions. But I highly recommend that if you're, again, just getting your toes wet with B2C, that you use Entra External ID. Unless you have specific use cases, then you can evaluate using Azure AD B2C with those identity experience framework custom policies. So if you're already using Azure AD B2C, don't sweat. Microsoft's fully committed to continue support of Azure AD B2C and help those customers who are leveraging the platform and helping build out a solution to move to the next generation platform. The Entra External ID tenant, the feature parity is more tightly coupled with the workforce tenant capabilities. So that's why it's a better recommendation to use that, because as Microsoft innovates and improves their security offerings within even the workforce tenant, they go almost hand in hand with the capabilities of the external tenant compared to the Azure AD B2C tenant. So a lot more better feature updates on the security side that you'll probably see coming forth with Entra External ID. But again, they're both being maintained and developed until an announcement will be made in terms of any deprecation or migration. So lastly, whether it's solution management, solution training, or solution enablement, feel free to reach out to us. We can help you with your CIAM and IAM cloud or security journey. So feel free to reach out directly to me or visit our site at atmosera.com. And as I mentioned earlier, there'll be a post survey to the webinar, and that will be an opportunity to reach out to us as well if you need assistance. So now I'd like to open up the floor to Q&A. Apologize if I've not given a lot of time towards the end, but if there's any questions, feel free to post them to the chat, or if Rachel might be able to help you come off mute if you need to speak to that, we can do that as well. So any questions you guys have regarding the content, Entra External ID, B2C, or B2B? And Rachel, I don't see anything in the chat, so I don't know if there's anything that you have.
Yeah, no, it doesn't look like there's any questions in the chat or the question. So I think we can end. And appreciate everybody coming to the webinar.
Oh, there's a question I see. Does it support internationalization? Yeah, so if you're talking about localization, it does, both B2C and Entra External ID. So that's part of the branding. Let me see if I can find that. There's branding configuration. Let me get to the other tenant. So to answer your question, yes, it does support internationalization in terms of page localization or tailoring content to a specific locale. And there's also even the ability to do data residency as part of an add-on purchase service. So if you are specific, to GDPR in Europe, you can have your tenant, even though it's a globally scaled service, you can have the data for your customers reside within a specific geolocation. I'm trying to see the chat, and I think there's another question. Will this presentation be made available in your YouTube channel? So I believe the answer to that should be yes, and Rachel can confirm that.
Yeah, that's correct. And I also will be emailing out a link to that. Okay, it looks like that's all the questions.
Yep, and if there's any more, feel free to email me or again, contact us. Again, we'd love to help you with your journey, whether it's CIAM or IAM or any of the cloud security solutions. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. I hope you find this knowledgeable and hopefully enjoyable in terms of understanding Entra External ID and some of the new offering and capabilities coming out of Microsoft. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.